An interviewer sits down across from a candidate, glances at the resume, and sees the name of their own college. Nothing about the candidate's actual qualifications has changed in that moment, but something in the interviewer shifts anyway. A spark of trust appears from nowhere they can point to, a feeling that this person is somehow more trustworthy, more competent, more of a fit, before a single interview question has even been asked. That spark has a name. It's called affinity bias, and it is one of the most common, least noticed ways that companies end up building teams that all think alike without anyone ever deciding to. Affinity bias is the tendency to favor people who resemble us, whether that resemblance shows up in background, in interests, or simply in how someone talks and carries themselves in a room. It's worth being precise about what this is and isn't, because the label gets thrown around loosely. It is not conscious prejudice. Nobody sitting in that interview chair is thinking, I prefer people who look and sound like me, and I'm going to act on that. If you asked most hiring managers directly whether they'd ever favor a candidate for a reason that has nothing to do with the job, they'd say no, and mean it. Affinity bias operates underneath that layer of conscious intention entirely. It's a mental shortcut, one of the oldest and most deeply wired ones humans have, because for most of human history, resembles someone from my group, actually was a reasonably useful proxy for safe to trust, back when your group was the 50 people you'd known your entire life, and a stranger genuinely might be dangerous. That wiring never got updated for a world of resumes, interview panels, and job requisitions. Similarity still feels like safety on a gut level, and safety still feels like competence, even though in a hiring context, the two have nothing to do with each other. A shared alma mater tells you nothing about whether someone can do the job. It just feels, in the moment, like it does. The evidence for this isn't just intuition or anecdote. Studies on resume screening have shown this effect directly and cleanly. Take two identical resumes, change nothing about the actual content, the education, the experience, the skills listed, and simply swap the names attached to them so the names signal different backgrounds. The ratings, the exact same resume receives shift, even though every single qualification on the page stayed word for word the same. That's about as clean a demonstration as you can get that something other than merit is doing at least part of the work in how candidates get evaluated, because the only variable that moved was the name at the top of the page. And this is the part that should give any manager pause. That experiment strips away every excuse a hiring manager might reach for afterward. There's no interview chemistry to point to, no vague sense of culture fit to invoke, no communication style mismatch to blame. The resume is identical. The experience is identical. The only thing that changed is a signal of background, and the rating moved anyway, which means the shortcut isn't waiting for an interview room to activate. It can fire off a piece of paper before a candidate has said a single word. The same mechanism doesn't stop once someone gets hired either, which is a piece of this that rarely gets talked about. It shows up again every time a manager decides who gets pulled into the high visibility project, who gets the benefit of the doubt after a rough quarter, or who gets mentioned first when a promotion conversation comes up. A manager who unconsciously reads a certain kind of communication style as sharp and a different, equally competent style as merely fine is running the same affinity shortcut on performance evaluation that showed up on resume screening. It's not a hiring day only phenomenon. It's a standing filter that keeps quietly shaping who gets opportunities long after the offer letter is signed, which means fixing it only at the hiring stage and assuming the job is done leaves the exact same mechanism running unchecked everywhere else careers get decided. What makes affinity bias unusually hard to catch, compared to more overt forms of discrimination, is that it never announces itself as bias to the person doing it. A hiring manager who passes over a strong candidate because of affinity bias almost never experiences that decision as, I am being unfair right now. They experience it as good instincts. They experience it as chemistry. They experience it as, I could just tell this person would be a great culture fit, or the classic half-joking version of it, someone I'd want to grab a beer with. Every one of those phrases feels, from the inside, like a legitimate professional judgment about whether someone will thrive on the team. From the outside, looking at the pattern across dozens of hiring decisions, it can look like something much narrower, a preference for people who remind the decision-maker of themselves, dressed up in the vocabulary of team fit. Walk through how this actually plays out in a real hiring process, because the mechanism is worth seeing step by step rather than just naming it. A hiring manager is staffing a role and has two strong finalists. Both meet the bar on paper. One of them went to the same university as the hiring manager, worked at a company the hiring manager respects, and happens to communicate in a style that feels instantly familiar, quick, casual, peppered with the same kind of references. The other finalist is equally or more qualified, but their communication style is more formal, their career path took a less conventional route, and there's no obvious personal touchpoint connecting them to the interviewer. On paper, this should be close to a coin flip, maybe tilted toward whoever has the stronger track record. In practice, the interview with the first candidate often just feels better. It flows. There are fewer awkward silences. The hiring manager walks out of the room with a warm, confident feeling about candidate 1 and a slightly more effortful, harder to articulate assessment of candidate 2, even if candidate 2 answered every question just as well or better. That warm feeling gets reported up as stronger interview, and the harder to articulate assessment gets reported as good, but something felt a little off. And from there, the hiring decision tends to write itself. Notice what didn't happen anywhere in that story. Nobody compared the two candidates' actual work samples side by side. Nobody scored their answers against a shared standard. The entire outcome hinged on a felt sense of ease in the room, and that felt sense of ease was substantially a product of surface-level similarity, not underlying capability. This is precisely why affinity bias survives so well in senior, experienced hiring managers who would never tolerate an obviously unfair process on paper. The unfairness never shows up as a rule anyone wrote down. It shows up as which of two equally strong interviews simply felt more comfortable to sit through. And comfort is a genuinely terrible proxy for who will do the best work. Multiply that single decision across every hiring round a company runs, year after year, and the workplace cost compounds quietly in a way that's genuinely hard to see from inside any single decision. This is worth sitting with, because it's the part that turns a personal quirk into an organizational problem. Teams that hire on affinity, hiring round after hiring round, end up with narrower thinking as an accumulated result. Not because any individual person on the team is unqualified. Every single person hired that way can be smart, capable, and hard-working. The problem isn't the quality of any one hire. It's that everyone ends up sharing the same blind spots, because they were selected, at least in part, for resembling the person doing the selecting, who themselves resembled the person who hired them. New ideas, when they do surface, get filtered through the same lens over and over, evaluated by people whose instincts, reference points, and assumptions about how things are done all rhyme with each other. A team like that can look highly functional from the inside. Meetings run smoothly. People finish each other's sentences. Consensus comes easily. That smoothness is often exactly the symptom, not a sign that everything is working, because a room where everyone already agrees on the unstated assumptions rarely produces the friction that surfaces a genuinely different idea before it's needed too late. But here's the part that catches most people off guard once they actually look at how affinity bias operates. It doesn't require anyone to want a homogeneous team, and it doesn't require the company to be doing anything obviously wrong on purpose. A hiring manager can be genuinely, sincerely committed to building a diverse, high-performing team and still fall for this every single time they trust their gut in the room, because the bias doesn't feel like a decision being made against fairness. It feels like fairness. It feels like exactly what a good hiring process is supposed to produce. A strong, confident read on who's the right person for the job. That's what separates affinity bias from the more obvious forms of discrimination that companies have spent decades building policies against. Nobody needs to hold a bad belief for this to happen. They just need to trust an internal sense of chemistry that was never actually measuring job performance in the first place. And almost every hiring process on Earth still asks managers to trust exactly that sense, usually right at the end of the process, right when it matters most. This is also why affinity bias survives so well even at companies that genuinely care about it. Plenty of organizations run bias awareness training, put up the right values on the careers page, and still end up several hiring cycles later, with a team that looks remarkably uniform. Awareness alone doesn't neutralize an unconscious mechanism, because the mechanism was never routed through the part of the brain that responds to being told about it. Knowing intellectually that affinity bias exists doesn't stop it from firing in the specific moment a hiring manager meets a candidate who shares their alma mater and feels that instant spark of trust. The bias operates faster than the conscious correction can catch up to it, which is exactly why the fix that actually works looks nothing like a training module. The referral pipeline makes all of this worse before a candidate ever reaches an interview, and it's worth naming separately because most companies actively reward the exact behavior that feeds affinity bias. Employees refer people they know, and the people someone knows well enough to refer overwhelmingly tend to share their own background, their own school, their own industry circles, their own social world. A referral bonus is a perfectly reasonable thing for a company to offer, but it's quietly stacking the incoming pool of candidates toward affinity before a single interview has even happened. By the time a hiring manager sits down with a referred candidate, there's often already a warm introduction, a mutual connection, a sense of pre-established trust in the room, which means the affinity spark isn't starting from zero, it's starting from a running head start the non-referred candidate never gets. None of that shows up on a diversity dashboard as bias. It shows up as, we have a strong employee referral program, which sounds, and often is described internally, as a purely positive thing. The practical fix is structural, not a matter of willpower or good intentions, and that distinction matters enormously for how a manager should actually respond to this. Telling hiring managers to simply try harder not to be biased is asking them to outthink a mechanism that, by definition, they can't see happening in themselves in real time. What works instead is changing the process so the bias has less room to operate, regardless of who's running it. Use standardized interview questions, the same set, asked in the same order, to every candidate for a given role, so the interview isn't quietly reshaping itself around whatever topics happen to build rapport with a particular person. Score every candidate against the same rubric, ideally before comparing notes with other interviewers, so first impressions and general vibes don't get to anchor the whole panel's read before the actual evidence gets weighed. And separate, explicitly and on paper, the question of whether you'd enjoy working with someone from the question of whether they can actually do the job well, because those two questions get quietly merged into one gut feeling far too easily. And once merged, there's no way to tell which one is actually driving the decision. There's a smaller, easy-to-implement version of this worth calling out on its own. Write the scores down before the group debrief, not during it or after. The moment a hiring panel starts talking before everyone has independently recorded their own rubric score, the most senior or most vocal person in the room quietly anchors everyone else's opinion, and whatever affinity that person felt toward a particular candidate spreads through the whole panel disguised as consensus. Independent scoring first, discussion second, is a small procedural change that costs almost nothing to implement and does more to blunt this than any value statement ever will, because it forces the evidence onto the table before the room's collective gut feeling gets a chance to take over. There's a genuinely useful diagnostic hiding in all of this, worth calling out directly rather than leaving implicit. If your team looks remarkably similar after several hiring rounds, in background, in communication style, in where people went to school or what kind of company they came from, that's not a coincidence, and it's not proof that you simply found the best people available each time. Homogeneity, that consistent, hiring round after hiring round, is what affinity bias produces by default when nothing structural is pushing back against it. That's the pattern running the process quietly in the background, one comfortable decision at a time, each one individually defensible, each one felt as good instincts in the room, adding up over years to a team that thinks in remarkably similar ways without a single person ever deciding that's what they wanted. The management takeaway here isn't distrust your gut entirely or hire people you actively dislike working with, because that overcorrects into a different kind of dysfunction. It's narrower and more actionable than that. Build the structure first, standardized questions, a shared rubric, evidence collected before impressions get compared, and let the chemistry conversation happen only after the actual qualifications have already been weighed on equal footing. Treat that instant, effortless spark of trust as data worth logging, not data worth acting on immediately, and ask what specifically produced it before letting it move a decision. That spark of instant trust with the candidate who reminds you of yourself isn't a signal to ignore completely. It's a signal to be suspicious of exactly because it feels so effortless, and to double-check with a process that doesn't care whether two people went to the same college. A hiring process built this way will occasionally feel slower and less satisfying than trusting your instincts in the room, and that friction is the entire point, because the instinct it's slowing down is precisely the one doing the damage. More of these on this channel, follow along.